All right, we just saw in the last video about opposites or additive inverses. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to use that idea of additive inverses to subtract, because subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. For example, if I have 9 minus 5, that could be written as 9 plus a negative 5. We're adding the opposite, which gives us 4. Or if I have 5 minus 8, I could add the opposite of 8, which is negative 8. And so what we can do is we can always take a subtraction problem and make it into an addition problem by adding the opposite. That's what we're going to do now. Look at example 5 with me. Subtract each of the following and then check with addition. So it says 2 minus 6. Now some of you can figure that out in your head. Or what we can do is we can change this subtraction problem into an addition problem. Instead of saying 2 minus 6, how I can write it is 2 plus the opposite of 6, which is negative 6. So 2 plus a negative 6. We know those are opposite signs, so I can subtract. 6 minus 2 is 4, and keep the sign of the bigger number. So my answer is negative 4. What about B? If I have 4 minus negative 9, well, minus, subtracting, is the same thing as adding the opposite. So 4 minus negative 9 is really 4 plus what's the opposite of negative 9? Positive 9, right? Or you can think of those two negatives making a positive, right? And so 4 plus 9 is really 13. Subtracting is really adding the opposite. So adding the opposite of negative 9, right? The opposite of negative 9 is a positive 9. So what about C? If I have negative 4.2 minus a negative 3.6, or I can say adding the opposite of negative 3.6. So negative 4.2 plus 3.6. They are opposites, so I can subtract. 4.2 minus 3.6 is 0.6, and keep the sign of the bigger number, that's negative, and I can say that I get negative 0.6. So changing these subtraction problems into addition problems might be more helpful. Let's finish off with D and E in this example. If I have negative 1.8 and I want to subtract a negative 7.5, or I could add the opposite of negative 7.5, which is positive 7.5. So now I have a problem that says negative 1.8 plus 7.5. They're opposite signs, so I can subtract and keep the sign of the bigger number. So 7.5 minus 1.8, and my answer is positive 5.7. Okay, it works the same way with fractions. If I have 1/5 minus a negative 3/5, I can really add the opposite of negative 3/5, which is positive 3/5. So really, I have the problem that says 1/5 plus 3/5. They already have a common denominator, so 1/5 plus 3/5 is really 4/5. And that can't be reduced. There's no factor of the numerator. That's the same as a factor of the denominator. So 4/5 would be my final answer. All right, so those are a few examples of two numbers. What if we get a little more challenging and we start to add a whole bunch of terms or numbers? Well, what it might be easier to do is rewrite this problem so that there's not all of these different double negatives or negative signs. So we can rewrite each little part. So what I did on this one is I have 8, and instead of subtracting a negative, could I add the opposite of negative 4, which is positive 4? And then instead of subtracting 2, could I add the opposite of positive 2, which is negative 2? So I'm adding a negative 2. And then the opposite of negative 5 is positive 5. And then we still just have a plus 3. So I can take any negative and change it into an adding of the opposite. So now I have this problem where I have a whole bunch of terms just being added. I have a positive 8, I have a positive 4, I have a positive 5, and I have a positive 3. Remember in our last video, I organized myself where I took all the positives and added them together. And so I did that and I got 20. And then I have my plus negative 2. So I have 20 plus a negative 2. They're opposite signs, so I can subtract. 20 minus 2 is 18, and I can keep the sign of the bigger number. So positive 18 would be my final answer on that one. But it was a little bit easier to rewrite it first before I started combining all those positives and negatives. So do the same thing with B. See if you can pause the video and rewrite the problem into an addition problem of opposites. All right, so on B, I have a negative 3, and then instead of a subtraction, I'm going to add the opposite of negative 1, which is positive 1, plus a negative 10, which is already a positive or a plus addition problem, and then minus 7. But instead of subtracting, I'm going to add the opposite of negative 7, or opposite of 7, which is negative 7. So I turned it into a whole bunch of addition. I've got a negative 3, a negative 10, and a negative 7, and then I just have one positive. Negative 3 and negative 10 and negative 7 is a negative 20 plus 1. They're opposite signs, so I can subtract. 20 minus 1 is 19, and keep the sign of the bigger number. So my final answer on this one would be a negative 19. So again, changing subtraction into adding the opposite might be a little bit easier for you to do before combining your terms.